The morning Cecily Marin left Ashvale Hall for the last time. The sky was the particular grey of old pewter, the kind that promises nothing and delivers cold. She had been given 1 hour. 1 hour to gather what she could call her own, which amounted to a carpet-bag of wool stockings, 2 gowns she had sewn herself, her father's Bible with the margins marked in a hand she no longer quite recognized as his, and a miniature of her mother that she wore pressed against her palm so no one would see her take it. The miniature was the size of a watch face painted on ivory, and the woman in it had dark eyes that Cecily had always believed she recognized in herself, though she had learned by then to keep such beliefs private. The charge against her was £40 missing from the household accounts. £40 she had not touched. The accounts ledger lay open on the steward's table when the housekeeper came to fetch her, and the figures had been annotated in a hand that was almost hers and not quite, the loops too wide, the sevens formed differently. She had pointed this out. Mr. Forger! Hadwick, who had managed Ashvale's books for 11 years, had looked at her with the calm of a man who has nothing to fear, and said that the discrepancy was plain to see, and that he regretted the conclusion it required. Lady Haberstock, who had engaged her as a lady's companion 3 seasons prior, did not come down. She sent word through the housekeeper that she found the matter deeply unpleasant and wished it resolved without scenes. Cecily, who had spent 3 years reading aloud, managing correspondence, accompanying Lady Haverstock to assembly rooms and morning calls and the particular tedium of afternoon visits, had no scene to offer. She walked to the door. The footman opened it. The cold came in. That was November. War. The lane from the gates of Ashvale was a 1/4 mile long and rutted by the autumn rains, and she walked it with the carpet-bag in her right hand and the miniature in her left, and did not look back. Looking back was a luxury for people who had something waiting for them at the gate. And she had only the lane and the grey sky and the fact of what had been done to her, which she carried the way one carries a stone, not for its use, but because it is too heavy to set down all at once. She slept that night at the village inn, where the landlady knew her face from Lady Haverstock's custom, and treated her with the cautious distance of a woman uncertain which side of the account she ought to be friendly toward. By December, Cecily was in a lodging-house in Bury St. Edmunds, where no one knew her at all, which was both the worst and the best condition she could imagine. By April, she had found a position in Ipswich as a copyist for a solicitor named Mr. Fenn, who cared nothing for social recommendation and a great deal for legible script and reliable hours. She arrived at 7 each morning and transcribed legal documents in a front room that smelled of old paper and coal smoke, and she was very good at her work because she was careful, and because she did not speak to anyone who was not strictly necessary, and because she had the kind of mind that finds the illegible legible, and the disordered, which was a quality no one had particularly valued in her as a lady's companion, and which suited the work of a copyist exactly. The other copyist, a young man named Peters who had ink permanently on his left thumb, treated her with the decency of someone indifferent to anything that was not the text in front of him, which was its own variety of kindness. It was Mr. Fenn, who noticed. He had a habit of reading over what she produced before filing it. Not because he doubted her accuracy, he had stopped doubting her accuracy by the 3rd week, but because he was himself a careful man, and careful men read things twice. One afternoon in February, he set down a property abstract she had copied, and looked at her for a long moment from beneath eyebrows that expressed everything their owner's voice withheld. The document was a property abstract for an estate in Suffolk, and among the names recorded in the chain of title was that of a family called Pemford, and the year was 1793, and the notation was brief, and it was there, a record of a connection acknowledged by Sir Aldrich Pemford of Ravensgate to Mrs. A Pemford, nee Ashbury, and listed as Cecily, and recorded with a solicitor's seal she had never seen before, and a set of initials she did not recognize, she had not known. Her mother, who died when Cecily was 4 years old, had been a widow in comfortable circumstances in a Hertfordshire village. She had told Cecily only that her father was a gentleman who had died before they could be married, That was the whole of it. The miniature on ivory, the dark eyes, a village grave with its stone kept clean by the parish sexton, and a story with no edges. Mr. Fenn was a careful man who did not speculate. He said only that she ought to see a copy of Sir Aldrich's original will, which was held at Doctors' Commons, and that if there was a provision for acknowledged natural-born children, she was entitled to pursue it through the proper channels, and that if she wished, he would assist her in identifying what those channels were. He said it quietly, as though he were discussing a question of conveyancing, rather than the entire architecture of her life. Cecily thanked him and went home to her rented room above the cobbler's shop, and sat for a long time in the dark with the miniature face up on the table before her, and the sound of the street below moving without her. It took 3 months to gather the documents. She gathered them the way she had learned to gather everything, since November, methodically and without expecting assistance, though assistance came in small measures from Mr. Dinna. Fenn, and from a barrister. He knew who charged her. Half his usual fee, and told her afterward that he had charged her that much only to prevent her from feeling it was charity. The birth registration from the parish of St. Jude's in Hertfordshire, which she had to travel there to obtain, and which required a half-day's searching through the register by an elderly clerk who did not approve of the errand but could not refuse it. A sworn deposition from Mr. Fenn himself regarding the will codicil now in his custody. A letter in Sir Aldrich Pemford's own hand and seal, written 6 weeks before his death, addressed to his man of business, acknowledging the child by name and directing that provision be settled on her from a specific named property account. The letter had never been executed. Whether by accident or by design she could not say, and she spent several evenings trying to determine which of those possibilities made her feel worse before concluding that both made her feel the same, and that the question was therefore unproductive. There was also the matter of Ashvale. She had not known this part until the barrister identified it, working through the chain of title in the documents she had brought him. Sir Aldrich Pemford had been the elder brother of the late Lord Haberstock. The estate she had been dismissed from in November by the widow of the man who had inherited it from her own father's brother was the estate from whose accounts her portion had been designated. The estate from which she had been expelled under a fabricated accusation. The connection sat in her chest for several days, like a coal that would not cool. Mr. Fenn said he would write to the family solicitor at Ashvale. He said it in the measured voice of a man who has written difficult letters before and expects this one to be among them. She did not go back in triumph. She knew better than that. She had studied Lady Haverstock for 3 years, and she understood exactly how the neighborhood read its returning members, and she understood that triumph, announced or implied, produced a particular kind of resistance that was not worth producing. She went back in early June, when the roses were beginning at the Ashvale gates and the lanes were warm with the smell of new growth and the whole county was preparing for the Derbury Assembly, which was the single social event that organized the neighborhood's summer into a before and an after. She went by hired carriage and carried the documents in a leather satchel Fenn had given her, and she wore a gown of dark green that was not plain exactly, but sober. And her hair was dressed neatly, and she had on her best gloves, which were white kid, and had been a luxury she allowed herself on the morning she left Ipswich, because she intended to shake hands with several people, and she intended to do it correctly. She had not known, when she arranged her arrival, that the Earl of Ravensgate would be at Ashvale. He was there because he was the heir to Sir Aldrich's title, the next male line, a distant cousin who had come into the earldom in 1812, and because Lady Haverstock had written to him about the solicitor's inquiry. His name was Edmund Carow, the Earl of Ravensgate, and he was 34 years old, and had the bearing of a man who has spent a decade making decisions he does not apologize for, and he had arrived 3 days before Cecily, and reviewed the documents, and had apparently concluded a number of things. She learned this from the housekeeper, who came out to meet the carriage with an expression that was not precisely welcome and not precisely refusal, which was itself information. Cecily had expected Lady Haverstock. She had prepared for Lady Haverstock. She had rehearsed the exact register of courtesy she intended to maintain, through what she expected to be an uncomfortable encounter with a woman who had not come down to her dismissal and who had spent 7 months in Bath avoiding the consequences of her steward's conduct. She had not prepared for a man who was standing in the hall when she was shown in, with his coat still carrying the dust of several days' travel and his hat in his hand, looking at her with the particular attention of someone who has been told something and is quietly revising it against what he actually sees. "Miss Marin," he said. "Not a question, my lord," she said. He had gray eyes, the color of the sky in February. Not cold exactly, but clear and without illusion, and a jaw that seemed made for keeping its own counsel. He looked at her for 3 full seconds before he said, "You will want to sit down." She did not sit down. She kept her hands on the satchel and said, "I have the documents with me. A birth registration from the parish of St. Jude's, in Hertfordshire. A sworn deposition from Mr. Fenn of Ipswich regarding the will codicil, now in his custody. A letter in Sir Aldrich Pemford's own hand and seal directing provision for his daughter. A copy of the Pemford family register showing the chain of relationship." She said it steadily, the way she had practiced saying it on the road from Ipswich, her voice in the empty carriage, the fields going by outside. "If you require time to examine them, I am prepared to wait." He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, "I have already examined copies. Mr. Fenn was thorough." A pause. "The documents appeared genuine." "They are genuine," she said. "Wry." Something shifted in his face, not softened, exactly, but adjusted. The way a man's expression adjusts when he has anticipated one thing and received another. He said, "Will you sit, Miss Marin? Not because you require it, but because I would prefer to discuss this without standing in the hall." She sat. Lady Haberstock was not at home, she learned. She had gone to her sister in Bath upon receiving Mr. Robb Fenn's first letter, and no one expected her return before the autumn. Cecily absorbed this information quietly. She had spent months imagining this conversation, and in none of its versions had Lady Haberstock been absent. The house felt different without her, larger and somewhat stilled, the way a room feels when the particular presence that animated it has been removed, and what remains is only the furniture and the light. The Earl sat across from her at the long table in the east sitting room and laid out what he had established. The documents were genuine. Sir Aldrich had been her father. The provision directed in a letter had never been executed, which meant she had received nothing she was entitled to. The question before them was what should now be done, and it was a question that required the involvement of the estate solicitor, who was already aware of the situation and would be available to meet later in the week. He said none of this in the voice of a man doing her a kindness. He said it plainly, as though they were both rational persons confronted with a set of facts requiring a rational response. And she found she was grateful for that precisely because she had braced herself for condescension. What she received was something more like its opposite, and she filed this away without letting it show. "There is also the matter of Mr. Hadwick," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "I am aware of it." He annotated a ledger in a hand designed to resemble mine. He used it to remove a companion who had begun to notice discrepancies in the estate accounts. She had been careful with this in the months of her preparation. She had said it to Mr. Fenn and to the barrister, and each time she said it, the bones of it held. The structure of it remained what it was. "I did not steal £40. The accusation was constructed." "I believe you," the Earl said. She had not expected that. She had expected to argue for it. She had expected exactly the skepticism she deserved as a woman of uncertain birth and no social standing, making an accusation against a man 11 years in the family's employ, a man who had offered the quiet authority of his position against the uncorroborated word of someone with nothing. The simplicity of his believing her, stated without qualification, made something constrict in her throat that she had no intention of allowing to become visible. "How do you know?" she said. He reached into the pocket of his coat and produced a sheet of folded paper, which he set on the table and pushed toward her without speaking. It was a letter in Hadwick's hand. She recognized it immediately. The two wide loops. The distinctive sevens, just as she had known them in the annotated ledger. The letter was addressed to a man in Norwich and referred to an arrangement for the transfer of funds from an Asheville property account, and it predated by 8 months the annotated ledger entry that had cost Cecily her position. Someone had found it and held it. The Earl, she gathered without asking, had had Hadwick's correspondence reviewed as part of his examination of the estate management, because he was the kind of man who reviewed correspondence when he examined estates. And he had found this, and he had kept it. She looked at the letter for a long time. She read it twice. Then she looked up. "He is still here," she said. "He will not be," said the Earl, "by morning." There was a silence. Outside the window she could see the kitchen garden, which she had walked past 1,000 times during her 3 years as Lady Haverstock's companion, and which looked exactly as it always had, orderly and unremarkable, the same potato rows, the same herb beds along the south wall. This was the strange thing about injustice. When it is finally confronted, the world it had deformed looks exactly the same as before. The garden did not care. The roses at the gate did not care. Only she cared, and only she felt the peculiar vertigo of a fact being restored to its true shape. "I would like to see Mr. Hadwick," she said, "before he is dismissed." The Earl looked at her. "That is not necessary." "I am aware it is not necessary," she said. "I would like it none the less." A pause, in which he regarded her with that particular quality of assessment she was beginning to recognize as his habitual way of reading people, the way a man reads a document he is deciding whether to sign. Then he said, "I will arrange it." The confrontation with Hadwick was brief. She had imagined, in her months away, that it might satisfy something in her when she finally stood across from him with the truth restored between them. It did not, particularly. He was a small man made, smaller by being caught, and he sat behind the desk in his room with his hands flat on its surface. And she told him that she was aware of what he had done, that the documentation of his conduct was preserved in the hands of Mr. Khan, Fennand, in the records of the estate solicitor, and that she had come to ensure he knew she was not the nameless, discredited nobody he had calculated she would remain. She did not threaten him. She had nothing to threaten. She simply named the truth in his presence, which was the thing he had worked to prevent her from doing, and having done it, she left, and the feeling she carried away was not satisfaction exactly, but something cleaner. The feeling of a debt accounted for accurately. At last, if you have stayed with Cecily this far, you already know what kind of woman she is. She came here with documents, not demands. She came to name the truth, not to perform it. Leave her a word below if you have known someone like that, someone who kept faith with what was real, when there was very little reward for doing so. The Derbury Assembly met 3 days later, as it always did in the first week of June, when the county had come in from its spring labors and the long evenings allowed for the particular luxury of dressing well and going out. Ward had moved ahead of Cecily, as word always moves in a summer county, faster than any carriage and more thorough than any letter. Some of it was accurate. Some of it had accumulated invention along the way, as word will do. What arrived in the assembly rooms was a version of her story that the neighborhood had already begun deciding what to do with. Mrs. Bramley, who was the neighbor Lady Haverstock had been closest to, and who therefore considered herself the appropriate authority on anything touching the Asheville household, greeted Cecily at the door of the assembly rooms with a smile calibrated to express sympathy without committing to anything it might be held accountable for. She said that Cecily had had quite a time of it. One could not imagine the difficulty, and said it in the voice of a woman who imagined it very well and had already determined what conclusions the neighborhood ought to draw. To the room, in effect. She was announcing that Cecily's position remained unsettled, that she was a curiosity the season had not yet categorized, and that those waiting to follow a lead from a reliable social authority might want to wait a little longer before extending their warmth. Cecily thanked her for the greeting. She found a chair near the east wall. She sat in it with the posture of a woman who has nothing to prove, which was the posture she had always maintained, and which had never prevented people from requiring proof of her anyway. The Earl arrived at 9:30. She did not see him come in. She was attending to a conversation with the vicar's wife, who distributed her attention impartially among everyone present, and had always been kind to Cecily during her years as Lady Haverstock's companion, not as a matter of social calculation, but simply because kindness was her habitual mode. Cecily became aware of the Earl because the room became aware of him first, that particular rearrangement of attention that moves through a gathering when someone with social consequence arrives, the slight turning of bodies, the recalibration of conversational trajectories. She looked up, because it was impossible not to. He was looking at her. He had been looking at her since he came through the door, she realized, because his gaze did not move when she found it. He stood with two men she did not know and did not particularly register, and he looked at her across the full length of the assembly room with the same quality of attention he had brought to the East sitting room 3 days ago, as though she were a fact requiring his accurate accounting. She looked away. Her pulse was less cooperative than her expression. He crossed the room at 20 minutes before 10. Not toward her in a direct line, he paused twice to speak to people along the way. A minor courtesy, and then a brief handshake with a man she did not recognize, but the direction was consistently hers, and she knew it before he arrived. When he did, he simply stood beside her, which was itself a thing the room would note, and said, "Miss Marand, are you well?" "Quite well," she said. "Thank you, my lord." He stood. He did not leave. After a moment, he said, "My grandmother was at Ravensgate when I came into the title. She did not approve of me. She said I was too methodical for society, and not methodical enough for a man of business." A pause. Brief. "I have never entirely resolved which she meant as the greater criticism." Cecily looked at him. "Which do you think she intended?" "Both, I suspect." She was precise in her cruelties. His voice was even undefended. "She reminded me of someone I encountered 3 days ago in an East sitting room. Not in the cruelty. In the precision. The warmth in her face was not visible to the room, she believed. It was not invisible to her. She said, 'That is not a comparison I have heard before. Is not frequently useful,' he said." He turned to look at the room, not away from her, beside her, which was a subtle difference she registered. "Mrs. Bramley is watching us." "Mrs. Bramley has been watching since you arrived," she said. "I know," he said. "I am watching her watch." She understood then that this was not accidental. She was not certain what it was. Exactly this, standing beside her in a room full of people who had not yet decided what she was, this deliberate occupation of the same square of floor. She understood it was not accidental. "Patience." He asked her to dance. She said yes, because there was no reason to say no that would not itself be a statement, and statements were something she had always made carefully. The dance was a country reel, and he was correct in his steps and not stiff. And she did not look at him more than the figures required, and he did not speak except once when they came together at the top of the set, and he said quietly, so that only she could hear it over the music, "Hadwick was gone by dawn. I thought you should know." She said, "Thank you." He said nothing else. The music continued and the figures turned and the room watched, because the room always watches, and the Earl of Ravensgate danced a reel with the woman who had been dismissed from this county's most prominent estate in November, and who had returned in June with documents that rearranged several things at once. The weeks that followed were not simple, and she had not expected them to be. The neighborhood's social machinery does not reverse itself on a Tuesday evening because a man danced a reel with someone the room has not yet categorized. It requires several Tuesday evenings and several mornings of called-upon visits from women who have been watching, which way the reliable authorities are leaning, and have decided the direction is now safe enough. The visits came. Not all of them, and not quickly, but they came. Mrs. Bramley's daughter called on a Thursday, which was the first, and she sat for 20 minutes and asked careful questions and said before she left that she hoped they might see more of each other, and there was no calculation in her face that Cecily had not seen in a dozen social faces before and learned to read accurately. The estate settlement was advancing. Mr. Fenn corresponded regularly with the Ashvale solicitor, and the Earl had appointed his own man to oversee the accounting. And the shape of what Cecily was owed was becoming concrete, which was the thing she had come for. She reminded herself of this on the evenings when she sat in the cottage, with the documents in the writing desk drawer, and the miniature on the mantel, and the quiet that settles over a place when there is no one else in it. The Earl of Ravensgate came to the cottage 3 times in the first fortnight after the assembly. The visits were brief and conducted correctly, the door open, the woman from the neighboring farm who had been engaged to help with the household within earshot in the kitchen. They discussed the settlement, which was proceeding as Mr. Sebent Fenn had predicted. They discussed the Hadwick matter, which the solicitor was documenting for the estate's records, and which would not, the Earl said, go further publicly unless she wished it. To a decision he left entirely in her hands. On the second visit he brought with him a copy of a codicil she had not yet seen, an addendum to Sir Aldrich's instructions written in a different ink and a different year, 1800, which suggested that Sir Aldrich had thought of this provision again at the end and had wished to ensure it was not overlooked. She read it twice at the table, while the Earl looked out the window at the kitchen garden, and she did not say anything. Until she had read it a 3rd time. Then she said, he thought of her again at the end. Yes, the Earl said. He was still looking out the window. She set the document down. Thank you for bringing this. You should have it, he said. He turned from the window and looked at her across the table. It is yours. On the 3rd visit he also said, without segue, that he had read in Sir Aldrich's original letter that Sir Aldrich had described her mother as a woman of excellent character who had deserved better than circumstance had given her, and that he found this description had passed accurately to the daughter. She was quiet for a moment, measuring the thing he had just said, and its implications, and the fact that he had said it at all. Then she said, You read his letter carefully. I read every document carefully, he said. I found this one required a second reading. She set down the cup she was holding, because her hands had become less reliable than she preferred them to be. She said, Why? He said, Because he was describing someone I had met. This was the moment she understood that she had not come back to Ashvale only for documents. She had thought she had. She had been very precise about her intentions because she had nothing but her intentions to rely on, and she had told herself that the restoration of what she was owed was the only purpose of her return. She had been precise in the way that a woman must be precise who has had everything else removed from her. She was not certain, looking at him now, that this remained the entire truth of the matter. My lord, she said, keeping her voice steady, I am the natural daughter of a man who died before he could acknowledge me legally. I have been dismissed as a thief from this county's most prominent household. I am at this moment residing in a cottage on an estate to which I have a documented, but not yet settled claim. You are an earl. I am aware, he said, of all of these facts. I am listing them, she said, because I want to be certain you have given them their proper weight. I have given them, he said, considerable weight. Since approximately the moment you stood in the hall and declined to sit down and listed your documents instead. A pause. I found myself revising several assumptions I had arrived with. The fire in the cottage hearth had burned low while they talked. Outside the window the evening was settling, and the roses at the gate were open now. Fully, a red she could see even at this hour, in the fading light. She said, I need more time. I know, he said. He did not say it as a concession, he said it as a man who has anticipated the answer and finds the anticipated answer correct. She did need more time. Not because she was uncertain of herself. She had never been uncertain of herself in the ways that the world had attempted to make her uncertain, but because she had spent the better part of a year learning to trust only the things she could document and verify, and a feeling, even one as specific and insistent as this one, was not a document. She was careful with herself, in the way that people who have been wrongly accused must learn to be careful. She did not rush toward things that had not yet earned her confidence. She was also, she discovered, not made of stone. The Derbury Assembly met again in July. She went. He was there. He found her near the east wall, where she had sat in June, and he said that the solicitors had reached a figure, and he wished to discuss it with her at her convenience. And she said that Thursday would suit, and he said Thursday then. And he stayed beside her for the remainder of the first set with his, hands at his back and his shoulder a careful distance from hers, and the room watched. And this time, the room's watching was beginning to mean something different than it had in June. She began to permit herself to read the accumulation of evidence, the way he spoke to her, the way he had appeared in the hall with the letter he had found, the fact that he had believed her without requiring her to argue for it. The second reading of the document, the third visit to the cottage, which had no practical justification beyond the one he had provided, when he said, because he was describing someone I had met. She was a careful reader of evidence. She had made herself one. And the evidence was saying something she had not expected it to say when she hired the carriage in Ipswich and set her gloves on in the early morning, and made herself ready to go back. The estate settlement was confirmed in August. Her portion, the sum Sir Aldrich had directed, and which had never been paid, plus an annual income drawn from the named property account, was documented, registered, and hers. The family solicitor shook her hand in his office, with the careful warmth of a man who is glad the right conclusion was reached. Mr. Fenn sent a letter from Ipswich saying he was gratified and not surprised. Peters added a line at the bottom, in his careful copyist's hand, that he hoped she was getting on well, which was the most he had ever written to her, that was not a transcription of someone else's document. The miniature of her mother she set on the cottage mantel, face forward, in the light from the east window. This was the first time in her adult life she had placed it somewhere rather than kept it on her person. There was a difference, she found, between carrying a thing and giving it a place to rest. She wrote a letter to the sexton at St. Jude's in Hertfordshire, thanking him for the care he had taken of her mother's grave, which was the only thing she had noticed when she visited in April, that the stone was clean and the grass close cut, as though someone had been tending it all along. He wrote back that her mother had been a well-liked woman in the parish, and that he was glad someone had come finally to see the stone. She wrote to Mr. Fenn. She wrote to the barrister who had charged her half his usual fee. She wrote 3 letters, and sent them all on the same morning, and then sat in the cottage with the settlement document in the drawer, and the miniature on the mantel, and the sound of the birds in the garden, and the particular quietness of a thing that has been finished. The Earl of Ravensgate came in September. He came in a late afternoon, when the light came through the cottage windows warm and low, and he was not dusty from the road this time, and he had sent no word ahead. She opened the door herself, which she had answered before she thought about it, and looked at him for a moment, and then stepped back to let him in. He had brought nothing. No document, no letter, no pretext of estate business. He stood in the low-ceilinged room with its fire and its afternoon light, and said, "I have been patient for 3 months." "I know," she said. "You have been very patient." "I am not," he said. "Naturally patient." Something in her chest gave way, that she had been maintaining in its held position for 3 months, through careful practice. She said, "I know that too." He said, "Cecily." She had known it would be a marked event. When it came, she had known, in the part of herself that kept accounting for the evidence, that there would be a moment when it arrived. She had been right about it being marked. She had not been right about how it would feel. It was quieter than she had expected, and more final. She said, yes, not to a question exactly. To him, to the room and the light and the miniature on the mantel and the settlement document in the desk drawer, and the months of accumulated evidence that some things are exactly what they appear to be. He crossed the small room in 2 steps, and she met him in the middle, which was its own declaration, and when he took her hands, she did not look away from his face, and there was nothing in this moment that required documentation. Some things carry their own proof. She had learned in the hardest possible school to recognize a genuine thing when it was in front of her. The Derbury Assembly met again in December, as it always does in the week before Christmas. when the county comes in from the cold and the candles are lit against the dark, and the music is a little faster for being the last gathering of the year. They arrived together, which the room understood without being told. Cecily, in deep blue, that she had chosen herself and paid for with money that was now legitimately hers, the miniature at her throat, on a new chain the Earl had given her. The Earl at her left hand with the careful posture he always maintained in public, and with something in the set of his shoulders that anyone who had watched him in June would recognize as changed. Mrs. Bramley greeted them both. This time the smile committed itself fully to its warmth, which was its own variety of conclusion. The two young women who had contrived not to see Cecily in June contrived to see her very clearly in December, and she greeted them with the same courtesy she had always extended, because it had always been natural to her to greet people courteously, and because there was nothing to prove by doing otherwise. The music began. He did not ask her to dance. He offered his hand as though the asking had already happened somewhere else, in a cottage in September in the low afternoon light, and she took it as though the answer had been given there too. The room watched, and the room's watching this time was warm and familiar, the watching of a body that has incorporated something into its understanding of itself, and is no longer startled by what it sees. Later, when the carriages had come, and the assembly rooms had given back their quiet, she stood at the cottage window with the fire at her back, and the snow coming down outside. The first real snow of the season, fine and straight in the still air. She held the miniature between her thumb and finger, and looked at her mother's painted face in the firelight. The dark eyes looked back patient and familiar the way they always had, unchanged by the months in which everything else had changed. There was nothing left unresolved. Her portion was settled. Her name was established. The man who had falsified the ledger was gone. Lady Haverstock had returned from Bath and met with the solicitor, and said very little, which was perhaps the closest she was capable of coming to acknowledging what had been done. The neighborhood had completed its slow process of recalibration, and had arrived at a position it would maintain. Cecily put the miniature back on the mantel where it now lived. She had propped it against a piece of grey stone she had picked up from the road near St. Jude's churchyard in Herefordshire, on a cold morning in April, when she had gone to find her mother's grave, and had found it clean and tended. She had taken the stone because it was the right weight for a pocket, smooth and substantial, and because some things you carry not for their usefulness, but because they remind you what solid ground feels like underfoot. The snow fell outside, straight and quiet in the dark. The fire settled in the hearth. She was in the right place at last, and she knew it without needing to prove it to anyone, which was, she understood now, what being in the right place actually felt like. Not the absence of opposition, not the completion of a document, simply the stillness of a thing restored to what it should have been. The stone sat under the miniature on the mantel, her mother's eyes in the firelight, the snow and the quiet and the warmth behind her, which was not hers by accident but by the long and careful work of refusing to believe that what had been done to her was the final word on who she was. Thank you for staying with Cecily to the end of it. If there is a moment in her story that stayed with you, leave it below.